Going for the last session. Thanks to everybody who has stuck it out. It's a pleasure to introduce Chris SINHA from Hunan University. Chris has worked on a huge range of topics in cognition and social aspects of language. He's worked on a wide variety of languages. He's worked on animal cognition. He's worked on a great deal of topics involving representation of space and time. And he will speak to us today on events in mind, space, and time.
Thank you, Michael. Well, thank you also, and above all to Jurgis for inviting me here to this amazing meeting. And thanks also to all the participants, and of course especially the speakers who have given us such a kind of rich menu of food for thought. And usually when giving a talk about a particular topic which is related to other talks, I try to intersperse reference to those talks, but there's just too much to do that, so I'll just leave it to you. If you want to interrupt me also, please do. I'm quite happy to have at least snatches of dialogue as we go along. My purpose today really is, well, you'll see what I'm talking about, but I'm hoping very much to provoke. And if that means provoking challenges to what I say, that will be fine. But if it provokes some perplexity, that will also be fulfilling my objective. Okay, with no further ado, I will just say a word about the people that I'm collaborating with on different parts of this talk. Peter Jerdenfors from Lund University, Vani Sampaio from the Federal University of Rondônia in Brazil, Vera da Silva SINHA from the University of East Anglia, and yes, she is my spouse, and Jörg Zinken from Mannheim University. Time. What is it? Where is it? Questions. Is everything in the physical universe, without exception, located in space and time, or, which is not the same thing, space-time? Is time everywhere the same? Does time's arrow travel at the same rate everywhere, unidirectionally? Does the universe really have an age? Can time be said to exist independently of an experiencer or observer? If you don't know the answer to those questions, you're in good company. That's all I'll say about that. Here is an ontological challenge regarding time and coming from time. Here's a statement. The world is made of events, not things. A filling out of this. We can think of the world as made up of things, of substances, of entities, of something that is. Or we can think of it as made up of events, of happenings, of processes, of something that occurs. That's a quote from Carlo Rovelli from his very recent book, The Order of Time. Who is Rovelli? Is he perhaps a French situationist philosopher? No, he's not. He's a leading theoretical physicist. Time in mind. This is very encapsulated. Time is part, we can't doubt it, of the experiential or phenomenal life world. And it has, as many philosophers have pointed out, at least two fundamental perceptible aspects: duration and sequential order, both between events and within events, as we talk about when we talk about thematic roles in events. What about time from a biological point of view, time in the organism and in the brain? Well, here's something we know. Life on Earth is biologically adapted to the diurnal and seasonal cycles, whether we're talking about plants or animals. So reproductive cycles, cycles of migration, hibernation, alternation of sleep and wakefulness. Human beings are often said to have a genetically determined biological clock whose mandate cannot be ignored without detriment to health, as some people are finding out at this moment. What about this biological clock and its role in perception and memory? Is some kind of biological clock the foundation for all temporal perception and cognition? Well, we know that the distinction between short-term and long-term memory is neuropsychologically based. The perception of short-term time intervals has been claimed to be governed by this biological clock in relation to animal learning experiments. And it is also true that some animal species, I'll come back to this, have a capacity for memory and anticipation, usually cued by events or stimuli. But there is no time in the brain. At least that's what many neuroscientists are beginning to claim. Here is another quotation. It would be unimaginable to perform contemporary neuroscience research without referring to spatial and temporal units. Measurement, of course. However, declaring from such comparisons that some brain region or mechanism represents space and time, or calculates distance or duration, is another matter. Studying transformation rules between brain structures does not require resorting to concepts of space or time. This is from an article in Trends in Cognitive Sciences by Busaki and Tingley from this year. And their article is, I mean, they're actually talking about the hippocampus, but they're making a much wider point, which is the doubt that attaches to the very psychological, to the neurological reality of the notion of time and space, or their separability, really. What about this notion, which everybody probably has heard and thought about, mental time travel, which I will approach in terms of a distinction between cued and detached representations. Some higher mammals, such as apes and elephants, appear to have episodic memories as well as learned behavioral routines and repertoires. Some corvids can anticipate search at hidden food locations without being cued, okay? They don't need a cue. They seem to have some memory, and in hiding things, they also seem to anticipate that they will be searching in the future. Some apes can remember not only episodes, but also use these memories in planning action sequences, which does, by the way, raise the question of the extent to which they're able to organize event representations into structures. Such mental time travel depends on having detached representations, as my colleague Peter Jerdenforsch puts it, context-independent event representations of some kind. However, nothing in the animal kingdom remotely approaches the event representation capacities of a 3-year-old human child. From the work of people like Catherine Nelson, we know about young children's, what she calls narratives in the crib. a 3-year-old can tell stories, including remembered, anticipated, and imagined event representations. No other animal can do that. They can use adverbs and tenses to locate events in time relative to the present. And my claim, and that of my colleagues, is that it is event representation, not the biological clock, that is actually the key to understanding both the language capacity and conceptualizations of time. And there's a bit missing here, which would be Peter's work on conceptual spaces and why we don't need a variable called time. But I'm going to miss that out. Events and their locations. Objects are thought of, this is kind of referring to previous stuff as well. Objects are often thought of as located in space and endure, however fleetingly, in time. They have properties like mass and energy. Events are thought of as located in time as well as in space, having properties, as we have seen, of duration and succession. As language users, we employ temporal landmarks to orient ourselves in time, just as we employ spatial landmarks for spatial orientation. Spatial landmarks might include the table, the room, Riga. Temporal landmarks might be today, yesterday, Sunday, the 9th of December, my birthday, which is not today, and so on. There are also temporal duration words, time interval nouns like seconds, minutes, hours, and seasons, adjectives such as long and short. And a very common phenomenon is space-time mapping, the use of spatial terms to indicate temporal succession and duration and movement, as in Christmas is approaching. What kind of time intervals do we find in languages? First of all, we find event-based time intervals, which are those whose boundaries are constituted by the event itself. In this sense, there is no cognitive differentiation between the time interval and the duration of the event or activity that defines it. The reference event is often natural, such as spring, like let's take a holiday in the spring, but sometimes conventional, such as coffee break. Let's discuss this during coffee break. There are also what we call metric time intervals, sometimes called clock time and calendar time, especially by anthropologists and sociologists, and these are those whose boundaries are constituted by a segmentation of a conceptual domain of time as an abstract and measurable entity, what we call time as such. Examples of metric time intervals are hours and weeks. Although metric time intervals are based upon natural astronomical cycles of events, they are conventional, and their duration is determined by division and counting in a number system. In the case of our hours and minutes and so on, this particular metric time system can be traced back to ancient Babylonia. Metric time systems can be considered as instruments dividing the substance of time as such into quantitative units. Calendric and clock systems have a recursive structure in which different time interval units are embedded within each other. Calendar and clock time is cyclic and crucially depends upon number systems. You can't have metric time without numbers to measure. Here we have a clock in the Swedish city of Lund from the cathedral. Such clocks are quite common around northern and central Europe, and they began to be constructed in medieval times. I don't have time to go into the history of the clock, but it's actually very interesting. Of course, they're very beautiful artifacts, but the important thing is they are artifacts of a very special kind. They are cognitive artifacts for organizing our minds, but of course also they're social and cultural for organizing our social life. Now, the question is this, one question: is there a universal cognitive domain of time? Okay, neuroscience says maybe not. Even if all human beings experience what we call the passage of time, concepts of time vary dramatically, as we'll see. Temporal landmarks and duration words are conventional and culturally created, and clocks and calendars are definitely historical human inventions. But is there a universal cognitive domain of time, analogously to space? And do all people structure this domain similarly? Some people do say so. In fact, there is a claim, which I will call the universal mapping hypothesis, which says this: time as space, okay, spatialization of time, spatial metaphors for time. Time as space is a deep metaphor for all human beings. It is common across cultures, psychologically real, productive, and profoundly entrenched in thought and language. That's from Fauconnier and Turner, 2008. We disagree. The key hypothesis, or set of hypotheses, underlying our research is that the detached concept of metric time as such is a cultural historical construction dependent upon cognitive technologies, that is, symbolic cognitive artifacts. Metric time is cognitively represented in timelines, clocks, and calendars. And we further claim that systematic constructional space-time metaphor is present only in languages and cultures with cognitive technologies for representing metric time. And before I go on to talk in detail, just so that, well, I'll just give you the spoiler. The key findings of our research are that linguistically represented event-based time intervals do appear to be universal in human cultures, that reference to past and future in relation both to the present time and to detached event-based time intervals is a transcultural linguistic universal. However, the detached representation of the temporal dimension itself, this notion of time as such, is not a transcultural universal, and that systematic space-time metaphor is also not a transcultural universal. Time and timelines in philosophy. A philosopher called McTaggart wrote an article in 1908 which was called The Unreality of Time. And he talked about what he called two series of time, two temporal series. The first was that series of positions that runs from the far past through the near past to the present, and then from the present through the near future to the far future, or conversely, in which events are past, present, or future with respect to a deictic viewpoint, the now. Okay? That's why researchers now call this deictic time, which is more motivated than a series. And he conceived of this as a directional timeline, but actually it need be neither a series, because you can have only two events, one thing past or future in relationship just to now, nor does it need, as we'll see, to be a line. But that's how he thought of it, because everybody thinks of it that way in our culture. because it may be nothing more than a categorical distinction, past versus future. Henceforth, we'll call that D-time or deictic time. Oh dear, this keeps happening. And then he talked about the B-series, which he calls that series of positions which runs from earlier to later, or conversely. How is that different? Well, it's a directional timeline in which events are earlier than or later than or before or after other events. So it's a two-place predicate, okay? Or maybe are dated with respect to some metric dividing the sequence, for example, clock or calendar time. And sequentiality, but not necessarily rectilinearity or cyclicity, is inherent, and the viewpoint can either be internal or external, or in a blend with deictic time, deictically anchored. And that's where you get a lot of what we call tense, a grammatical tense from. Henceforth, we'll call that S-time or sequence time. D-time, deictic time, is the basis for tense, for adverbial deictics such as tomorrow or yesterday, for temporal landmarks such as next weekend, for tense constructions and ordinal terms in which, such as the day before yesterday, in which you can blend D-time and S-time. There we go again. Are D-time expressions universal? Well, not all languages have verbal tense. As is well known, Chinese does not have verbal tense, also Yucatec Maya, for example. Some languages do blend tense and aspect in nominal tense aspect mood, Amazonian and African languages. No language has ever been documented that lacks deictic adverbials indicating gradations of pastness and futurity with respect to the time of utterance. I apologize for that. What about S-time? Are S-time expressions universal? S-time is even more variable in linguistic expression than D-time. Not all languages have before and after terms. For example, Yucatec Maya and Amondawa, which I will be talking about. Probably, however, not sure about this, all languages have early and late terms, but these are not always morphologically and discursively distinguishable from earlier than and later than. Okay. S-time has diverse representations. It may be represented in tense, not universal. Calendars, also not universal. For example, Ainu, Amondawa, and Yelid, Nye cultures. In ordinalized D-time, I won't even say what that is, it's too complicated. In verbal narrative, every narrative has a kind of a sequentiality, right? And then, and then, and then. And pictorial verbal narrative is probably universal. Pictorial narrative is not universal. Kinship and descent systems, including naming systems, such as in the Amondawa, which I will talk about below. So, the story so far. As far as we know, all languages and cultures have conceptual and linguistic resources for organizing both D-time and S-time. D-time, especially tense, has been more researched than S-time in linguistics. S-time research has mainly been the preserve of anthropology and cultural psychology, and S-time schemas vary cross-linguistically more than D-time schemas, but both are characterized by a kind of unevenness of elaboration. Some tense systems are very complex, some are non-existent, for example. It is not the case that languages that lack elaboration in D-time also lack elaboration in S-time or vice versa, and neither does elaboration of one subsystem correlate with elaboration in another. In In the isolate language Yelid-Nye, which has been investigated by Levinson and Majid, it's an island called Russell Island off the coast of New Guinea. They have no calendar, very limited time interval system, but 6 tenses and corresponding temporal adverbials, and a really complicated thing called ordinalized deictic time, which I'm not even going to try to explain. On the other hand, you have Mayan languages, including Tzeltal and Yucatec Maya, which have elaborate classical calendars, cyclic S-time schemas, but no lexemes for before and after, and no verbal tense. Okay, lots of variation, but they all have both D-time and S-time in one way or another. Now, I'm going to go back to this what is time issue. Here is a quote from Isaac Newton, okay? He wrote in his Principii, absolute, true, and mathematical time in and of itself and of its own nature, without reference to anything external, flows uniformly, and by another name is called duration. Relative, apparent, and common time, that is like everyday time, is any sensible, perceptible, and external measure, precise or imprecise, of duration by means of motion, like pendulums, basically, and such a or the measurement of days, rotations around the Earth. Such a measure, for example, an hour, a day, a month, a year, is commonly used instead of true time, because he believed that there was a thing in the universe called time, true time, and we measure it, okay? This is where the idea of metric time comes from. This is time as such, okay? And from this, you get not only the notion of time as such, but you will notice, even in Newton's scientific characterization of time, the use of a metaphor, the metaphor of flowing, okay? I call that a passage metaphor. It's a metaphor for passage. And it raises the question, can we think about time independently of space? Here are some metaphors. My birthday is coming up. I am coming up to my birthday. Check-in is ahead of boarding. I don't know why it does that. Here are some conceptual schemas proposed to organize space-time metaphor. One is the experience of moving along a timeline towards or away from an event. Moving ego, as in, I'm coming up to my birthday. Or an event moving towards or past the experiencer along a timeline. We call that moving event. Slightly different terminology from Herb Clark, but you'll see why. So my birthday is coming up. Usually the future is located in front of the experiencer and the past behind the experiencer. That's certainly the case in English, but the converse schema exists in Aymara, an Andean language, in which the future is behind and the past is in front. And this has been attested and shown in gesture as well as in language. And that was also the case, by the way, in ancient Greek. And then we have another schema, the schema of positional time, as a spatialized sequence of events like beads on a string, before-after constructions, front-back constructions, and grammaticalized time according to many conventional representations. So here is the moving ego event schema, and here is the moving, this is moving ego. So the deictic now is moving past an event, or up to and then past an event, like I'm coming up to my birthday. And here is Christmas coming, right? The event is moving, okay, towards and past the ego. Here's another schema, a nice poem by the English poet Andrew Marvell, one of the group of poets often called the metaphysical poets. And he's writing to his lover, to his coy mistress. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. And this amazing poem, which is about the kind of about mortality and there's a lot in there, but we call this the catch-up schema. Time is coming up from behind, and it's really the notion of moving time. Time itself is motion, just like Isaac Newton said around about the same time as this poem was written. So here are some time and timeline schemas. For reasons of time, I can't really go into it in great detail, but we have past and future. This is D-time with a now, and there's a kind of so you have two events, right? And then we can also make that an S-time schema. So we could say, 2008 is before or earlier than 2028, right? And now is, of course, 2018. And then we can have moving events, the event, so we can say old age is ahead, or we can say childhood is behind me, my childhood is behind. And then we can have, and this is definitely absolute moving time. Yeah, an event, a first event and a second event. This is moving event, and this is another S-time schema. Well, okay. So in D-time, events are past, present, or future with respect to a deictic viewpoint, and in S-time, events are earlier or later than each other in a sequence. Okay. But is the timeline really universal? Well, the recruitment of spatial, lexical, and grammatical resources for conceptualizing time is widespread. However, most research into space-time metaphor in language has investigated a limited sample of languages and cultures. And actually, there is a problem with this research because time is presupposed rather than shown to be a distinct cognitive and hence linguistic domain in all languages and cultures. That is this kind of notion of an event-independent Newtonian time as such, a time in which events occurs, as opposed to being just consisting of events. Right, we've talked a little bit about physics. Here are two statements from two different kinds of relativity theory. Here's a guy called Minkowski, who is a mathematician, a friend of Einstein. And he wrote, henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. And here's another relativist, Benjamin Lee Whorf. And this is part of his theory of linguistic relativity. He wrote, the Hopi speaker, Hopi being one of the so-called Pueblo languages of North America. The Hopi speaker has no general notion or intuition of time as a smooth-flowing continuum in which everything in the universe proceeds at an equal rate out of a future through a present into a past, or in which, to reverse the picture, the observer is being carried in the stream of duration continuously away from a past and into a future. So he's saying they don't have moving ego or moving time schemas. He's saying the Hopi Indians are actually not Newtonians. Now I'm going to talk about the Amondawa and our research with the Amondawa. The Amondawa are an indigenous group of about 120, probably more people now, living in the state of Rondônia in Greater Amazonia. The community was first contacted from the outside world in 1986. They speak a language which is a sub-branch of the largest indigenous linguistic family in the Americas, Tupian languages. All speakers are bilingual in Amondawa and Portuguese in varying degrees, except for the two oldest people, who by now probably are dead. The primary education is based on state education laws for indigenous peoples, and the language of instruction is Amondawa. The school is located in the village. This is a picture of Amondawa people at the time of first contact in 1986. And here's a child, also from the same time. Here is the chief. His name is Tari. Here are some Amondawa weapons. These are arrows, usually tipped with poison and very large, quite fearsome. Here are some Amondawa musical instruments. These are more recent pictures. And this is Tari with some other Amondawa people during a festival. This is a traditional Amondawa house, which houses a number of nuclear families. We'll talk about kinship in a minute. But this is how the village looks now, because because they were told by missionaries that they shouldn't live all muddled up together. They had to live as nuclear families or separately. This is the school, okay? And here is a Amondawa woman and child. You might notice, actually, these tattoos. That's part of the traditional Amondawa culture. Here is the Amondawa number system. Like that of many other Amazonian languages, almost all of them, as far as we know. In fact, we've done some research on this as well. It's very restricted. This is the number system. Oh my God, okay. There are only 4 numbers, okay? How is time expressed? There are deictic particles which express future and past, and gradations of future and past. In context, they can mean things like tomorrow or now. We have not fully investigated the meaning range of these expressions, but they're not used for spatial deictic reference. They're not spatials. Well, that's how you do it, actually. These are, that's how you do it in utterances. Amondawa have 2 seasons. The dry season, which is called in the sun, Quaripe. Quara is the word for sun. And these seasons are, I'm rushing a bit for reasons that are obvious. The dry season is divided into 3 subdivisions, and so is the rainy season, which is just called rain, amana. Okay? And here is therefore a seasonal schema. We've done it in a linear way, but that is basically our invention, okay? Is it real, the sequence of seasons? Well, we investigated this by getting participants to actually lay out paper plates which had drawings on them representing seasons and subdivisions of seasons. They laid them out sequentially, so they were able to spatialize the time cognitively. No cognitive problem with that. But they didn't actually do it in a kind of straight line timeline, okay? That's actually quite significant. The interval systems of season, but also the day system of times of day, have subintervals, But there is no superordinate year. There's no word for year. There's just the 2 seasons. There's no name for the week, and there's no name for lunar months. There are 4 names for lunar phases, and there is 1 application of the 4-item numeral system to time intervals, which is for enumerating moons, probably lunar phases. In other languages I will talk about, that is definitely the case. There is no calendric system. And then we have times of day, morning, afternoon, and night, further divided by customary activities such as time of waking, working, eating, resting, and sleeping. The social organization is based on exogamous marriage and division into 2 clans, or moieties. This kinship structure determines the onomastic or naming practices of the group, and the moieties are called by the names of 2 species of bird, including the Amazonian cockatoo, or arara. And they have a system of life stages, okay? This is a sequential time system. Amondawa people changed their names several times during their lifetime, and from these names we can infer the individual's age, gender, social position, and the moiety which they belong to. And this is a table of life stages with associated proper noun names of individuals, okay, with the life stages. I know I'm hurrying, but I don't have much choice. Now, the point is, in our culture, time intervals are structured by cognitive artifacts such as calendars and watches, which impose a quasi-static cultural model on moving time. In contrast, Amondawa time is structured by events in the natural environment and the social habitus of activities, events, kinship, and life stage. We can diagram Amondawa time, but there is a risk of distorting it by imposing Western cultural schemas of cyclicity or linearity. There are no spatial metaphors for time in Amondawa. I can't tell you the full methodology here. They will use motion verbs to talk about the motion of objects representing time intervals, but they reject the use of exactly these verbs in moving time and moving ego expressions. So the problem is not grammatical. The reason for this is conceptual and cultural. It's not a grammatical problem. It's not semantic to do with selection restrictions, nothing like that. And the other thing is, by the way, bilingual speakers perfectly understand moving time and moving ego expressions in Portuguese. So it's not the case, it's not a strong Wolfian thing that once you've got one language you can't acquire another because you don't have those concepts. No, they're cognitively flexible, but in their indigenous culture and language, these metaphors don't exist. In summary, there is no abstract word meaning time. Past and future are not expressed in verbal morphology. There is a complex nominal aspect system. There are only 4 numerals. There are no cardinal chronologies such as ages of individuals. There are no ordinal chronologies such as yearly or monthly calendars. And there are no passage or positional metaphors for time. But is Amondawa just a quirky, weird, strange language? Well, other languages have found to be lacking in a timeline. You could take Maya and Yeli Gne, which Levinson and Majid say lack both a calendric system and apparently spatial metaphors for time. And more recently, Vera da Silva SINHA has replicated. I have to say, replication in this context is not the same as an experimental replication. It's a complicated methodology issue of doing cultural comparative research, but meaning basically finding the same patterns, and extended these findings with 3 other South American indigenous languages, 2 Tupian languages and 1 Panoan language. In these languages, there is no mental timeline, only the actual paths of the movement of sun, moon, and stars. Spatial language is used indexically, but not metaphorically. The position, for example, of the sun is an index of a time interval, not a metaphor for it. Event-based time interval names in these languages, too, are not derived by metaphoric extension from spatial concepts. And very interestingly, this really is the most interesting bit in a way, past and future are conceptualized in terms of psychological capacities, memory, anticipation, imagination. And event-based time is reckoned or tracked using indigenous cognitive artifacts. So in Aweti and Kamayora, the past is considered to be located in their eyes, okay? The past is something you've seen, yeah? And in this sense is linked with memories, and the memories can be seen in the mind's eye in this metaphorical sense. Whereas the future is in front of the eyes, okay? The past is in your eyes, the future is in front of your eyes. So this is about memory and imagination. In another language, Hunikuin, the past is located, they believe, in the heart, okay? Past is in the heart. And the future is located in the head, okay? This is also related to vision because the future is what you see in the mind's eye or imagination. So heart and mind are the notions for past and future. So eyes, heart, mind, embodied concepts of past and future. In these languages, we contend, okay, this is a conjecture, all right, that there is no tense, but there is an aspectual conceptualization of past and future based on the completion and anticipation of or commitment to events. So it seems to us that the ontology of time in indigenous South America is based on events, their representation in terms of completion and attestation, and their mental status as remembered or anticipated. This can explain why, for example, and I am coming towards the end now, in Hachakuin, which is the name the Hunikuin give to their language, Hacha meaning the speech of the people, Hunikuin means the Shu people. In Hachakuin, future events are conceptualized as before and past events as after. Now, just think about that for a minute. You know, you've got two events, one is before the other event, and so which one is in the future and which one is in the past? If you think about that as a timeline, obviously the one in the past was before the one in the future, which is after, yeah? But not for them. No, for them, the one in the future is before and the one in the past is after. Oh my God, why? So we have a conjecture about that as well. How can the future be before and the past after? Because Hachakuin deictic time is not articulated grammatically or schematically with sequential time. There just is no timeline. D-time is related to attested completion of events and the intentions, desires, commitments of the speaker and the attested certainty of occurrence of events. They have an evidentiality system, okay? So it's related to aspect and evidentiality, not to D-time. So these two words, sha, after, and ishani, before, are not located on a timeline. Events can be metaphorically said to be passing in a certain way, but what's going on is that they're passing from before now, in my mind, okay, imagination, to after now, in my heart, okay? So here's the schema. Here is now, there's the past, there's the future. It's related to aspect and evidentiality. There's no line, there's no flow one way or the other. There are just two events in relationship, and there are incomplete events, which are before now, and completed events, which are after now, okay? Because once something's completed, it's gone, it's after, right? And that's in my heart, and that's in my mind, okay? This is our attempt to explain this. One last thing, an interesting finding which needs a lot more research is the way in which cognitive artifacts such as knots in a string and marking of wood are used for time reckoning. The Kamayora and Aweti untie knots on a string to index the progress of an expedition, fishing expedition actually, that will take place, okay? So it's to do with completing your intentions, actually. That's what it's about. It's not a count, or it's not a retrospective count or tally of days spent. Whereas in Hunikuin, they traditionally used to make a mark on a piece of wood, signifying the completion of a day or the activity making up a day. Here's a quote. Each cut on the piece of wood was a day's work or something that was done that day. Okay, so there are cognitive artifacts in these cultures too, but they're not clocks and calendars, right? So we're saying, I'm really trying to provoke here, it's time to rethink space and time in human cognition. All known human societies have ways of thinking about and talking about events and the temporal relations between events. No other species has a cognitive capacity for temporal relational thinking equivalent to that of a 3-year-old human child. Events and event structure are the fundamental building blocks of human conceptualization. So why do our philosophical and psychological theories continue to view objects as more fundamental than events and to reify events? Thank you.
We've got a few minutes for questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. That was provocative, and I think, but not. I don't find there to be that much disagreement with some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of how you would represent event ordering. Have you thought in terms of, since you would probably subscribe to a notion of embodiment, of semantic concept, embodiment.
Oh, the environment.
Embodiment.
Embodiment.
It seems as though the last data you had could be not necessarily explained by, but consistent with an intrinsic frame of reference of the face forward and the back past, as it were. So before is not really a relation, but just a modal, a directed modal block, which is not just a D series, but it's an ordered D series.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have thought of that. We think that that's not the case because of the ethnographic conversations that have been held. But it's very important to do more research, which is looking at multimodal representations, not just language. So looking at gesture, do they gesture behind, do they gesture in front? We haven't done that, and we do need to. They claim that neither past nor future are behind or in front, but who knows? I mean, I think ethnographic data are very important, but they need to be backed up by some other data, including multimodal co-speech gesture, and also we want to do some non-linguistic spatial tasks, and we also want to ascertain to what extent space-time mapping it really is cognitively available, even if it's not conventionalized, because we think it is, actually. But we think that attests more to a unified space-time than to a mapping from space to time. But you're absolutely right, and we need to look at gesture, we need to look at facing, whether people face a particular way. There is a lot of temporal gesturing. For example, they can point to a particular place in the sky, even when the sun isn't there, to talk about what a time of day is, and they have terms for that as well. So, yeah.
Other questions? Well, given that it's the end of a very, very rich day, maybe we should thank our speaker again and wrap it up.
So now we are reaching the closing point of the conference. to put it in temporal terms. And let me thank you for wonderful talks, for great interaction. It was a real pleasure to be a part of the host of the event. And thanks a lot. And I would like to also to thank my wonderful colleagues and helpers and our team. Let me thank to Liga, Krista, Egle, Nora, Lelde, Zane, and Rein. So we were, I think, doing amazing work last 2 days. Thanks a lot. And let me also thank again to our supporters, to the University of Latvia Foundation, to software company Accenture, to Robert Blumberg, who's not yet with us, but yesterday, Modis and Vali Galenieks, Latvian Child Neurology Association, and also Faculty of Computing and the University of Latvia. So without your support, we would not be able to do this. Thanks to all our supporters. And a couple of practical issues. We are also planning, as always, we are planning publication, which means that at some point, I expect February or March, we will send a circular to all contributed papers, to all contributed authors, but also to all invited authors. Please be responsive to our message and submit your papers. We will be very delighted and happy and thankful. And I would also like to, actually, I forgotten something very important. I would also like to thank to the program committee, because we did a lot of hard work in evaluating, in discussing papers, and thanks to Michael, Alexis, Nora Newcomb, Susan Rothstein, well, a couple of other people, but basically I think most of the work was in the hands of Michael and Alexis and Nora, I think. Yeah. And those of you who need a certificate, there are certificates on the table next to the entrance. Last but not the least, in case if somebody is staying in Riga until Wednesday or late Tuesday, there are a couple of entrance cards to National Museum of Art. So National Museum of Arts is always kindly supporting us. So anyway, so if somebody is staying a bit longer, just let me know, because there are some free entrance cards. And basically that's all from my side. Thanks a lot, and you are amazing. Thanks.